Um, so what I'm going to talk about is thinking beyond methods. So I'm not going to talk about upstream Kanban or discovery Kanban, or not that I don't want to talk about that, but this is some new material, and I'm quite enthusiastic about it, and I got carried away a little bit by my enthusiasm. So I'm aware that we're at a conference on the Kanban method, and so I'm asking to think a little bit beyond methods. So consider that as a challenge to take the next step. Okay. So the starting point. The starting point is. So we're seeing this very thriving agile industry, right? The top left is I think a really recent quote by a blog post or a post that Steve Denning wrote on Forbes about Spotify. So it's one of those agile successes. Everybody talks about the Spotify model. Then there's this McKinsey thing that they wrote about ING, a big Dutch bank, about their success. And then the bottom part is about some numbers that I took out of a survey. I think it's version 1 survey. So, a very thriving industry, right? That's what you might individually also feel. There's a lot of demand for agile services, right? So part of that success is driven by a legitimate need for agility, right? So a very legitimate need in terms of maybe in terms of flow, being able to deliver things faster to the customer, bring value to the customer in a shorter time. So that's in terms of flow. Or in terms of learning, dealing with the uncertainty. What do we need to deliver to that customer? What constitutes value for that customer? And then in terms of collaboration, there's a whole network of people involved in delivering that value. And so how do those people collaborate, right? There's a need for better ways of collaborating. That might be in function of the other two, in function of creating value more fast to the customer, in terms of learning, but it can also be a need in itself. Right? There's a war for talent, so there's a need to create a meaningful work environment. So collaboration is part of that. Okay? So that's kind of a legitimate need. So I'm going to talk a little bit about intuitive thinking, rational thinking. So I do want to have a little bit of an exercise at this point. So I'm going to ask you to take a neighbor or two neighbors and then try to discuss a little bit what your need in the environment that you're working, what your need is in terms of agility, right? And then look at that need might be in terms of flow or in terms of collaboration or in terms of learning. So try to find a specific need, and it might be in one of those three or all three at the same time, or you might have different needs, different needs in terms of flow, different needs in terms of collaboration, different needs in terms of learning. At the same time, I'm going to hand out colored cards. I'm sorry for, after hearing this morning's presentation, so it's colored. So accessibility, okay. So the new version has the color printed on it, but I don't. So the name of the color was printed on it. Yeah. Okay. So we learn as we go along. So I'll hand out the cards, and we'll use those cards afterwards. Okay? Yeah. So grab a neighbor, and then discuss a little bit what are your concrete needs in terms of agility. Can you help? If you start at the back. Okay, cool. Okay. We'll use them in a minute. Please, sir. Please. Please. Yeah. Please. Can I have some more red? Thanks. Hi, Adam. Please. I covered that row. Please. Get some more blue. Okay, here. You can continue, then you can write on them, yeah. You can tear them over. You can tear these off. Okay. So, Based on what you've discussed, just stick out the colors. You don't have 2 of them? Yeah. So stick up the colors where your need is. You can stick out 1 color, 2 colors, 3 colors. Okay. So is this what you expected? Is this what you expected? What do we see is a sea of colors, right? Some people are sticking out 1 color, some people sticking out 2 colors, some people are sticking out 3 colors. So what we see is a sea of colors, right? Many different colors. So what does that indicate? There's a diversity of needs, right? There's a diversity of needs in terms of agility. You're all working in different companies with different needs, maybe at different levels in the company, maybe at different functions. Maybe your company is doing complex system development, which is something different from a company that is doing services, which is something different from a company that is a startup or a scale-up. Yeah? So you've got many different needs of agility. Now, we've been doing this exercise in smaller groups. And so while I can't individually listen to all your needs, this is kind of the summary that we got out of this, this exercise. So at a high level, it has to do with just the fact that our business landscape has changed quite a bit. So if you represent the business fitness, which is the vertical axis there, if you take the business fitness, then as for example, how long a company stays into the Fortune 500 as an indication of business fitness, then we used to have a business landscape where you might have a couple of peaks in the landscape, companies that had been in the Fortune 500 for maybe, I don't know what, 100 years? Probably, yeah, or even longer than 100 years. I don't know how long it exists, but yeah, for a very long time. And then you might have a lot of which are in the middle somewhere, and then you have still an even bigger amount of companies that have not even reached the Fortune 500, right? Today, that landscape is quite different, right? So competition is global. So there's this like the stakes are much higher. If competition is global, it's a winner takes it all feeling. You can win and you win big, or you can lose and then you lose big, right? And then competition can come from everywhere. So that means that the landscape is continuously dancing. Okay? So that's at a very high level. This means that we need to be able to cope with volatility much more, right? So it's not only about having a big idea, a great idea, starting up company, growing that company, and then sustaining that company, but continuously being on the watch, on the lookout for where a threat might exist, where a disruption might come from, and then continuously renew yourself, right? Continuous renewal. So it's not only the front loop, it's also the back loop, right? Okay? So in terms of flow, it's not only about delivering to the customer faster, right? That's only one part of the equation. So it's not only about flow of work. Certainly, it's more than just the flow of work. It's the end-to-end flow. It's from suspected need to satisfied need. But even more than that, it's also about exploration, having a continuous pipeline of new ideas that may turn into new businesses, right? So it's very tangible flows. The very, very tangible flows are flows in terms of parts and materials, but maybe also tangible flows in terms of customer requests that need to be fulfilled. But very intangible flows also in terms of ideas, observations that you turn into experiments, and ideas that you turn into new businesses, new flows, and meta flows. Flows that about flows, right? Yeah? Okay. So flows of ideas, learning. So that makes the connection with learning. Okay. In a network of people. So that makes the connection with collaboration. Yeah. So the need is not only in terms of teams, self-organizing teams, teams that tightly work together. It's also about teams that make decisions together. It's also about teams that learn together. But also those teams are not there in isolation, right? They're in a network. Yeah? They're in a network that might be less, the interactions might be less tight, more loosely coupled, but still the teams work together in a network. Yeah? So we need to cater for the team as well as the network. Yeah? Especially when we have a network of teams where we need to learn across the teams. So again, there's a connection between the learning, the collaboration and the learning. But there's also a link between the collaboration and the flow, of course. Because often work needs to flow across teams. Right? Not only have interaction within the teams, but have flow of work or flow of ideas across teams. Yeah? And then finally, in terms of organizational learning, so the learning part today has been narrowed down a little bit by the lean startup, right? All about experimentation, yeah? But in our case, it's not only experimentation, yeah? Experimentation starts from an idea. Where do those ideas come from? Yeah? Where do those ideas come from? They come from experience, right? So it's not only learning from experimentation, it's also learning from experience. Yeah? So going through the loop of doing things and then experiencing the friction, and then based on that friction, start doing experiments. So it's not only learning on the individual level, yeah, but it's also learning on the social level, yeah? Social learning. Yeah? Okay? So that is what business agility is about for me. Okay? So it's that combination of flow, network interaction, collaboration, and learning. Yeah? At all levels of the organization. The learning, it's not only at the individual level, the team level, but it's at the organizational level. Flow is not only at the team level, but it's also at the organizational level. Collaboration, same thing. So at all levels in the organization, catering for the different needs in different types of organizations. Yeah? And we can think about flow, collaboration, and learning independently. But is business agility, is it either one of those three? It's the combination of those three. So we can think about them independently, but in the end, they're all tightly interacting with each other. They're all tightly linked to each other. You can't think about flow without thinking about learning. Yeah? So they need each other. Yeah? They need each other. Okay? So that's the legitimate need. Yeah? That's the true need. There's a less legitimate driver for the agile industry. Do you recognize this one? Yeah? Most of the time when I put up this slide, most people start like this little smile on most people, a smile of recognition, right? There's a bandwagon effect. Yeah? My peers are implementing this popular agile method. So obviously I need to, and they seem to be successful. So obviously I need to implement it also. Okay. Now that's really a serious driver in my analysis, it's really a serious driver for the agile industry. Yeah. Okay. I don't have numbers about it, but it might be a bigger driver for the industry than the legitimate need. Yeah? The legitimate need might be an initial motivation, but in the end, this is what drives the agile industry. This bandwagon effect. So the logic behind that is we look at our peers. We look at our peers, and they seem to be successful with one particular agile method. So we don't need to question the benefits. The benefits are clear, right? Yeah. So the biggest obstacle is not realizing a certain business benefit. The biggest obstacle becomes implementing the agile method, right? And we can declare success when we've overcome that obstacle. So we can declare success when we've implemented the agile method. Okay? You see the self-sealing aspect of this logic? Yeah? It's completely self-fulfilling. And what do we do when we've overcome the obstacle and we've created the success? What do? We publish articles in Forbes and McKinsey. Yeah? Because this is mostly associated with these big agile transformations. They cost a lot of money. Yeah? They cost a lot of money. Careers depend on it. Yeah? So we have an incentive to publish, to be very vocal about that success, which further feeds the bandwagon. Yeah? Which further feeds the bandwagon. So this is a big driver for the agile industry. So that's the good news about it. It's a big driver for the agile industry. It creates jobs, right? It creates jobs. But it also has a disadvantage, right? It has a disadvantage of creating a lot of shallow agile, right? So adopting the practices without adopting the thinking, or without adopting the underlying thinking, without a deeper understanding of why agile works and what makes it work. Okay? So we have plenty of examples, right? We're doing Kanban. We're not managing WIP, but we're doing Kanban, right? We're doing Scrum. We don't deliver at the end of the sprint, but we're doing Scrum. And then we have a discussion whether we should move from Scrum to Kanban, while we're not actually doing Scrum and we don't have an intention to really do Kanban, right? But we still have a big discussion about it. Yeah? An interesting discussion. So this is what we call incongruence. This is what we call incongruence. There's a big gap between what we think we are doing, or what we're saying we're doing, and what we're actually doing. Yeah? There's a gap between the thinking and the doing. Okay. Now remember that. That's a big theme. Yeah? Yeah? That's a big theme. It's the thinking and the doing. Yeah? Those are two different things. Yeah? If you got teenage kids, you know what the difference is. Yeah? Yeah? You know what the difference is. Okay. So this is incongruence, and we've got 360 degrees of incongruence in the industry today. Yeah. So 360 degrees of incongruence, meaning that practitioners, people doing the work, have an incentive to not say what they're actually doing, but to say what they're supposed to be doing. Yeah, they have an incentive for that. Okay. Management says, say as I say, not as I do. Yeah. Agile is something for the trenches, for the people that are doing the work, not for us. Okay. And then the agile industry has an incongruence in terms of we're talking about agile, but we're organized in maybe not such an agile way. Yeah? We're saying that we're bringing agile, but what are we bringing? The industry is an agile method, not agility. Okay? So we've got incongruence across all players in the everybody that is involved in here. Okay. Probably not with your organization, but at least with your friend's organization, right? Yeah. Okay. So incongruence, there's a difference between what I say that I do and what I'm actually doing. Okay. Now, people in the organization, they notice that incongruence, right? And so if people notice the incongruence, what do they say? What do they do? People that are actually the subject of our change, if they notice the incongruence, resistance to change, right? You have a workshop, and then what they say is, yeah, but you should talk to management, because they need to start, right? Or the other way around. Yeah. So incongruence leads to resistance, right? So I borrowed this model from Stephen Bungay. So any type of change does meet some level of friction, right? So if you've got change, then you can expect friction. So on the bottom, you've got the gap between what we think that or what we expect people to do and what people are actually doing, right? That's the alignment gap. That's one type of friction. If people are not actually doing what you expect them to do, then obviously your change will stall, will level off. Okay? So that's the alignment gap. Now, from what I've explained just before, the more you try to cover that gap, the bigger the gap becomes, right? The more you stress that people should do what you say they should be doing, the more chance that you have that they will become incongruent and they'll say yes, 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 but do no, 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 no. So as a community, the Kanban community, we've learned from that, right? Okay. So we moved from plant change towards evolutionary change, towards outcome-oriented change. So we started focusing on the effects gap, right? It's not about creating outputs, it's about creating outcomes. It's not about implementing practices, it's about the effect that you create. Right? So we moved beyond the alignment gap, and we started focusing on the effects gap. The effects gap is the gap between what you expect as an outcome and what the actual outcome is. Right? But there's still one gap left, which is the learning gap. It's not because you see a certain effect, right? It's not because your productivity goes up, or your lead times go down, or your quality goes up, that people in the process have learned from that, and that they have learned what you expect them to learn, right? And essentially, agile thinking is all about that. It's about not only what happens in terms of the results that you create, but also what happens up here in the mind of the people that are doing the work, or in the whole organization. So that's the learning gap. Learning gap is what you expect people to learn and what they actually learn. Okay? So we kind of seem to be, I'm too far away from the, so we kind of seem to be stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Okay? So bottom-up change, or let me start from the top down. Top-down change has the tendency, or the pitfall is that it stalls because of friction, right? Shallow agile, if we impose the change too much, it stalls because it becomes shallow. Bottom-up change as an alternative, might not reach the critical momentum. So it also has the risk of stalling, right? Okay, so we seem to be stuck between the hammer and the anvil of top-down change versus bottom-up change. Okay. Agile methods add to the friction. Yeah, they add to the friction in the sense that each method has its own view on what agility is. And then if you start imposing a certain agile method, yeah, people might have different opinions, might be in favor of another method, which leads to discussion, which leads to more talking and less doing. Okay, so agile methods do add to the friction. Okay, so they don't resolve the problem here. Okay, so the good news is we can escape that dilemma. We can escape the dilemma. We can escape being between the anvil and the hammer by doing a more profound type of change, by not only looking at the gap between plans and actions, so the plan change, where we close the gap between plans and actions by implementing a feedback loop between doing something, checking whether it's actually done, moving to outcome-oriented change, closing the effects gap, but actually closing the gap between doing a change and then what do we learn from it? What have we learned from that change? So including the thinking. Not letting the learning part being left over to chance. Because people will learn from the change, right? But what do you know that they're learning? Okay? And is the feedback loop short enough? So training up front, and then so doing the training, and then they execute. That's not covering the learning gap. Yeah, that's not covering the learning. And so it's a continuous feedback loop between doing something and then iterating in terms of the learning, so that people continuously learn through the change. Okay? Yeah? So let me elaborate on that, and also elaborate on how this helps to escape from this dilemma between top-down and bottom-up. Okay. So, thinking. So I need to learn also. Yeah. Okay. So thinking. So this is learning about agility. Is that completely out? Yeah.
So probably the battery is. You want to try this? Yeah.
Is this okay? Yeah, cool. So teaching agility, not teaching practices. Okay, so this is a model that we can teach. Okay, so notice probably you won't immediately understand the model, and I'm not going to explain. Yeah? Notice that this is a model about agility that we can teach, that we actually teach, but I'll explain the circumstances in a minute. This is a model about agility that teaches agility without talking about practices, right? So you don't need to understand the model, but what you can see is that it doesn't talk about stand-up or any agile practices. It doesn't talk about cadences or sprints or, yeah. What it does is it teaches how work works, right? It teaches how work works. It doesn't teach practices. So that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about teaching the agile thinking, we're talking about teaching fundamental concepts about how work works. In this case, it teaches how flow, collaboration, and learning interact at the team level. It's quite a unique for people that recognize this is a systems diagram. So notice that it's quite universal. Yeah, so it doesn't contain any practices, but neither does it contain any reference to the type of work that we're talking about. Yeah, so it teaches agility in a quite universal way, whether you're a software development team or an HR team, or a media and communications team, or a legal team. Yeah, it doesn't matter, and so that's what we're after, right? Because we need to speak to all levels in the organization, across all functions, and across all units. Okay, so it's quite universal. It doesn't contain any practices, and it teaches how work works, and it shows how flow, collaboration, and learning interact at the team level. Okay, so we're done, right? So we teach this, we explain this to people, and then we say, off you go, and obviously they'll start changing their behavior immediately, right? Yeah, probably not. Okay, probably not. So this is a very rational model. And in the Kanban community, we're very used to very rational models. But we're not talking about teaching mathematics here, right? Okay, we're talking about teaching something that needs to change in the behavior of people at their workplace. Okay, so before thinking about agile and teaching agility, we need to think a little bit about thinking, right? How does the mind work? And so this is quite ancient. We've got a divided mind. Our mind has an intuitive, a rational part. Next to the rational part, it has an intuitive part. In the Kanban community, we talk about system 1 and system 2. So it's the same type of concept. I'm not using Kahneman as a reference here, but I'm using Jonathan Haidt. It should be on the slide. It's on the next slide. I'm using Jonathan Haidt as a reference. He talks about the intuitive brain and the rational brain. I prefer that a little bit above system 1 and system 2 because I can't remember what 1 and 2 is. So it talks about the intuitive brain and the rational brain. So rational brain is you hear yourself thinking. So it's conscious thought. It's quite slow, but more rapid in learning. The intuitive part is unconscious. And most importantly, it's based on past experience. Right? It's based on past experience. And so that's the important part. It's pattern matching with past experience. So it's very fast, yeah, but it's a little bit more slow in learning because you need to build the experience, right? You need to build the experience. So often people associate the intuitive brain also with emotion, right? And also with social thinking. Yeah. If you encounter somebody, before you shook hands, you already have an intuitive feeling about that other person. Yeah. Okay. So we've got these two parts of the brain, and then obviously the big discussion is which role is played by what part of the brain in terms of making decisions. Right. Now we're not talking about making strategic decisions here. We're talking about day-to-day decisions in executing work, in the behavior. Okay, so when we're talking about behavior change, there's no discussion, I think. So it's the intuitive brain that dominates. So it's the intuitive brain that dominates. The rational brain actually is informed by the intuitive brain. Okay. So it's there to support the decision. Okay. The point is, it's hard to reason yourself into new behavior, right? It's hard to reason yourself into new behavior. So the sequence here is your intuition is informed by your past experience, which informs your judgment, which informs your reasoning. So that's the strong link. The weak link is from reasoning back to intuition. Sometimes we can reason ourselves into new behavior, but it's quite exceptional. Okay? So how do you then influence the intuitive brain? How do you create new judgment? How do you create new behavior? How do you create new intuition? By influencing the experience, right? By thinking about how can I design a new experience so that that new experience builds up into new patterns that forms new intuition. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is it's social intuition. So we're stepping away from the rational individual to social intuition. So intuitive brains, especially if they're good friends, the elephants, if you think about the intuitive brain as the elephant and the rational brain as the rider, the elephants, they influence each other. So they flock, they go together. Especially if you have people that you trust, that you have very tight connections with. And if you have a repetition of the same message, like in the keynote this morning, then obviously it influences your intuition. So we're influenced by our social, by our peers. So learning is not only individual, learning is social. So we're heavily influenced by our peers, but not only by our peers, but by the peers of our peers, and also by the peers of our peers of our peers. Okay? So most of you might know about 6 degrees of freedom, separation, 6 degrees of separation. Yeah? There's 3 degrees of influence, right? After three steps, influence starts to be negligible. Negligible? Yeah. Okay. So I want you to experience this for a moment because I've been explaining this all very rationally. So again, we're going to use the 3 cards here. And we're going to, within the confines of the limits of the constraints of the room here, we're going to build a social network, right? The social network is the people around you. Okay, it's the people around you. So what you do is, we're going to see how an idea spreads in a social network. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to stick up randomly a color, the color that you like. Wait a second. And then you stick it up, and then you look to your peers, the people around you, and you let yourself be influenced by your peers, right? So you take over the dominant color around you. Just around you, in the vicinity. Okay? So you stick up random color, and when I say change, so you look around, and when I say change, you change based on what you see around you. Okay? Yeah? Shall we do that? Okay. Okay, stick up the color. Change. Change. Change.
You have to change to keep the same color.
You can keep, huh? Yeah. Change. So this starts looking like the US. We've got a very strong polarization between blue and yellow. Yeah. Change. Change. Yes. Change. And so the liberals are winning, right? The liberals are winning. Okay. So I just want to make the point. So traditional plant change, how would that work? Yeah, that's a very linear type of change, right? Traditional plant change would be, I start with Steve and Luis here, or this little group, and I convince them to stick up blue. And then I take that group and I convince you to stick up blue. In the meantime, I don't see what they're doing, but and then I take the other group. And so step by step, team by team by team by team. And that's a very linear progression. The advantage is, of course, that I start seeing the result in one group immediately, right? And I start seeing linearly how the result builds up. Okay, that's linear change. Okay, with the social network, how did that go? It was chaotic, very long, and then suddenly, poof. Yeah, so we've got a phase transition, right? It's exponential change. Okay, that's what viral change feels like. Yeah. Okay, the disadvantage, of course, is that in the beginning, you don't see any progress. Yeah, so you need a little bit of patience. Yeah, you need to have trust in the system that it will take off after a couple of iterations. Okay? Good. So, how do we do this in practice? How do we do that in practice? So, we address the intuitive brain by simulation. Yeah. So, remember the intuitive brain. It's the brain that makes the decisions. Judgment is based on the intuitive brain, but it's influenced by its experience. So that creates a little bit of a bootstrap problem, right? Okay, you learn from that experience, but then in order to be able to experience it, you need to actually do it. Yeah, so that's a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem. Yeah, so we break that chicken and egg problem by simulation. Sometimes it's a little bit scary to do an experiment in your real work, so we create a safe environment in which people can do the experiment, so that they can build up the experience, yeah, and build their intuition based on the simulation. Okay, so we allow people to go through the full learning loop by performing work in a way that is representative of the way they're performing work right now, and then identifying the frictions. Yeah, and then do an experiment, learn from that, build a model from that experiment, and then use that to have a fresh look at their own way of working. Yeah? And so the type of model that we build is the model that I showed, the systems diagram. That's the type of model that we build in the process. Yeah? But we start with intuition, we start with the experience before starting with the rational part. The rational part is there to just have a visible, a tangible result. Yeah? Okay. So this is what we do. Yeah. So this is what we do at the team level. So we teach agility beyond the methods. So we're not teaching practices. We're teaching a fundamental understanding in how agility works or why agility works. So at the team level, this is an example of at the team level. We show what the correlation is between flow, collaboration, and learning. We show the correlation between having long lead times and what that means in terms of your collaboration and what that means in terms of your learning. Okay. We scale up by using the social thinking, by using social intuition, right? So how do we know that people have learned? How do we know that? Where's the feedback loop? Yeah? How can we measure the learning? Well, we can't measure the learning, but we can measure a side effect. Yeah? We can measure the retention and the referral. Yeah? So traditional change is this part. Acquisition meaning, I take that team here and I say, I'm going to train you. That's acquisition, right? Activation is we're doing the training, we're doing the coaching, and then we hope to see some results. That's linear change. And I do that team per team per team per team. Okay? What we're talking about, or vital change, is, first of all, we want to see some retention. Yeah? Before we start, we can seed a couple of teams. We can take a couple of teams and say we're gonna teach agility. We're gonna go through the simulation. But before we start putting other teams through the process, we want to see some retention. Is the team coming back to the simulation and using the simulation in their day-to-day work to address new challenges? Yeah? So it's not a one-off training, it's a coaching instrument. Yeah? Because if they come back to the instrument, if they come back to the simulation, it means that the simulation has value for them and that they learn from it. So that's an indication that they're learning. Okay? What's even a better indication is that they start infecting other teams. These guys start influencing their peers, and they can actually convince the peers to also step into this program. Okay. Is that a guarantee that they've learned? No, it's not a guarantee, but it's at least some indication that they've learned enough to be able to infect other people. Okay. Yeah. And that's the way we get exponential change. Yeah, that's the way we get change that sustains itself, right? Okay. So we turn it around. We turn it around in terms of we look at retention and referral as symptoms, as indicators of good learning. Okay. And before we start duplicating across other teams, we see that whether we have retention and referral, because if we don't have retention and referral, probably our way of approaching and teaching the agility is not the right way. So we shouldn't be duplicating it across other teams, right? Okay, so yeah, shallow change is linear. Yeah. Does that mean that we need to get rid of shallow change? I don't think so. Right? It has a certain function. Yeah, it has a certain function. It has a certain virality by itself. Typically at rituals, visual thinking, if you visualize it, it has a certain virality. Hence, the bandwagon effect. If you didn't have its virality, there wouldn't be a bandwagon effect. So it has a certain virality. So it creates a certain platform. It also has the advantage of being very visible, right? And creating visible results very, very quickly, right? Anyhow, the shallow change is already there. Yeah, it's already in most organizations, right? So we can't ignore it. Yeah, but we shouldn't be. We need to think beyond it. Yeah, that's the title. We need to think beyond that shallow change, yeah? And then use things like simulation, address the intuitive brain, and also address the social part of it, to create, to boost the agility. So I think about it more as a booster to agility. It's not a replacement, it's a booster. Okay? So that's the profile change the part. So if you think about it as a three-stage rocket, so yes, we're doing agility. Today, shallow agile is there. It's driven by methods. Yeah, methods have their function in there as a starter. They have their function, but we need to go beyond it. So we need to move from practicing to teaching and coaching practices to teaching and coaching agility. Yeah, in terms of how flow, collaboration, and learning interact with each other. Yeah? Address the intuitive brain. Use things like simulation, but maybe also storytelling, like we heard this morning. Yeah? Maybe also storytelling. Yeah? Address the intuitive brain and teach the essentials, teach the essence. Yeah? To take that next step. So that's the think beyond methods part. And then scale the thinking. Yeah? Scale the thinking by managing for viral effects. So it's really managing for viral effects. Leverage the social network. Okay. Yeah. So it's a change in terms of how we think about agility. So it's a change in terms of not thinking about agility in terms of practices, but in terms of how work works. Yeah. And it's a change in terms of how we think about change. Yeah, not imposing or not bottom up, but change in terms of including the learning into the thinking into the loop, right? To the profound type of change. Cool. Yeah. So thank you. Do we have time for questions? No. Yeah. Okay, cool. Any questions?